Hello, this is Fred Haight speaking. I was commissioned to revive a short video I had produced on O Canada, and since I can't find it, I'm doing it anew. And since I'm incapable of doing the same thing the same way twice, I'm preceding it with a bit of history in order to help locate the origins of this piece. A few years ago, I visited the only walled city in North America, Quebec. I grew tired of English speakers constantly saying, "What's wrong with Quebec? Why aren't they satisfied? What do they want? Why don't they just learn to speak English like everybody else?" To some of them, I say, well, what if Japan had won World War II? The United States had become a Japanese colony, and the Japanese insisted that we all learn Japanese and eat sushi. It's taken us 50 years to appreciate sushi, but I doubt if we would have ever submitted to speaking Japanese. And most of the people I say this to had never realized that Quebec actually was conquered militarily by the British. I visited Ile d'Orléans in the St. Lawrence River, just upriver from Quebec. It was first discovered by the French explorer Jacques Cartier in 1535. That places it 43 years after Columbus's Spanish-sponsored expedition to the Americas, but a good 50 years before Walter Raleigh's failed colony in Roanoke Island, and 75 years before the first successful British colony at Jamestown, Virginia. Even though the British had commissioned the Genoese explorer Giovanni Cavati to explore what is today known as Cape Breton Island as early as 1497. So the French colonies in North America are older than the British colonies. O Canada begins with O Canada, terre de nos aïeux, land of our ancestors. Ile d'Orléans has this, la maison de nos aïeux, where French Canadian people can look up their ancestors going back 500 years. But the French colonies in North America were also the largest. This is a statue in Quebec City of the great explorer Samuel de Champlain. Here you see a map of New France in 1750 compared to the British and Spanish colonies in North America, minus Mexico. You can see that the blue area, which is New France, is the largest. The Spanish have the southern parts, and the English colonies are in red, with the striped, blue and red striped colonies being areas that France ceded to Britain in 1713. The part of Canada known as the Maritime Provinces today was originally French. They called it Acadia, or l'Acadie, but with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, it was gradually ceded to Britain. So Ile Saint-Jean became Prince Edward Island, and Ile Royale became Cape Breton Island. And l'Acadie overall became Nova Scotia. Here is another statue of Champlain in what is today St. John, New Brunswick, but originally was part of the l'Acadie that he discovered. Britain and France went to war 5 times just in the 18th century. In the 1740s, the British established this huge, intimidating fortress called the Citadel on a hill in Halifax, solely for the purpose of doing battle with the French and capturing their large fortress at Louisbourg, Cape Breton Island, or Ile Royale it was called, and capture it they did. The war that took place between 1756 and 1763 is known to Americans as the French and Indian Wars. That's a misnomer, really. Winston Churchill once called it the First World War, and he wasn't wrong about that. It was a major war, and every power in the world was involved in it. The overriding goal of the British was to completely eliminate France as any potential rival whatsoever. In 1755, in preparation for the war that they knew was coming, the British committed one of the first modern genocides with the expulsion of the Acadians. They rounded up all the French speakers in what is today the Maritime Provinces, put them on leaky boats, and shipped them off with no destination in particular, and many died. France was defeated at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City, which you can see here. You can still see some guns pointing towards you. There are wars where the defeated country is not entirely wiped out, and though France itself was not wiped out, New France was. It just simply ceased to exist. All of the North American French colonies, except Louisiana, became British colonies. There were, to my knowledge, three major components to New France. In the south, you had Louisiana. That was ceded to Spain. As I said, every country in the world was involved in the 7 Years' War, and Spain got Louisiana, although later they gave it back to France, who foolishly sold it to the United States. A second area is what is today known as the Midwest of the United States. It includes cities like Detroit, states like Illinois, cities like Des Moines, and of course Lake Champlain. And in Detroit, they made cars on the River Rouge, including one named after another famous French explorer, the Cadillac. But the heart of New France was Canada. Now, this may surprise you, but the British stole the name Canada from New France. If you look at the area that's known as Quebec today, you'll see that it's called Canada, with three provinces, Montreal, Quebec, and Trois-Rivières. But the British said, we like the name Canada, we're going to take it, and you're going to call yourselves Quebec. And thus they passed the Quebec Act. So when Basile Routier opened these Chant National with the words, "O Canada," that in itself was an act of defiance. Wars were always being fought, of course, and battles have been won and lost, but this whole shutdown of French North America by the British was rather brutal. I took a tour of Quebec City in order to get a better idea, and the tour guide assured me that there is total collaboration between English and French speakers right now. Many things are done equally. The military academy follows both British and French rules. Gardens are designed according to both British and French principles. And here we see, for heaven's sakes, the Wolfe-Montcalm monument. Generals Wolfe on the British side and Montcalm on the French side both died during the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. But there's a monument dedicated equally to both of them. Well, that's nice, but is it really? Who ever heard of dedicating a monument to both the winner and the loser? And when an American asked this tour guide if they ever do reenactments of the battle, he shocked him by saying, "Oh no, it's way too sensitive for that to take place. Way too controversial." Well, excuse me, I lived in the American South for a number of years, and the passion over the Civil War is intense. This is a statue of a Confederate soldier in front of the courthouse in Leesburg, Virginia, near Washington, D.C. And yet, despite that passion, they managed to have reenactments of Civil War battles all the time. That suggests to me that the deep resentments in Quebec must be even more passionate and more intense than what we find in the American South. So, French Canada was fighting to maintain its sense of pride and of a national identity. And in 1880, the idea was put forth of a competition to write a national anthem. It turned out to be too late to have a competition if it was to be presented for the festivities of Saint Jean-Baptiste Day in Quebec City. So a committee was established of 23, headed by Ernest Gagnon. Gagnon was a composer, virtuoso organist, accompanist of plainsong, and collector of French Canadian folk songs. He published a volume of them. The author and judge, Adolphe Basile Routier, was assigned the task of writing the words. The man chosen to compose the music was Calixa Lavallee, a skilled composer and opera conductor who lived in the United States for a long time and fought with the Union Army in the Civil War. According to all three of these men, Lavallee insisted that he be allowed to write the music first and that Routier set words to the music after it was written. Though the piece opens with the words O Canada, it was published as Chant National with a photograph of the Lieutenant Governor of Quebec, Theodore Robitaille, on the cover. It was performed for the Saint Jean Baptiste Day activities in 1880 in Quebec City, and very appropriately in the Joan of Arc Park, or Le Parc Jeanne d'Arc. If I recall, the statue of Joan of Arc in that park was donated by Americans. It was a copy of a statue they had built somewhere in New York State, I believe. And that brings up an important point. This was not just French nationalism. These people looked to the American Republic for support. And here in Montreal, you see a Celtic cross donated to the people of Quebec from the people of Ireland for the great friendship and help that the French Canadians had shown to the Irish immigrants during the terrible potato famine of the 1850s. Many of the Irish immigrants shared the anti-British, pro-Republican sentiments of the French Canadians. This is a statue near the Quebec Parliament of Republican leader Joseph Papineau. Some of his closest collaborators were Irish patriots who wanted independence from the British Crown and looked to the American Republic. Yet, when our bus went around the Parc Jeanne d'Arc, our guide, in addressing the English speakers, merely mentioned that this is where O Canada was first performed in 1880. But when he addressed the French speakers, he added, en français, bien sûr. There was a defensiveness about taking pride in anything that had been accomplished in French Canada. The song was an instant success in French Canada. Lavallee was accused of plagiarism for using the march of the priest from Mozart's opera The Magic Flute. He was an opera conductor and undoubtedly would have known the work. Unfortunately, his associates responded by denying any connection to the Mozart, which I think is ridiculous. I am going to play, without the repeats, Mozart's March of the Priest right now, and I hope you will find, as I do, that on the one hand, there's no denying the connection. I think Lavallee had the idea in mind. I think that's probably why he wanted to write the music before the words. But there's also no doubt in my mind that O Canada is different enough that it's not plagiarism. It's its own independent piece. And that's a beautiful thing when a composer can quote another composer, especially one as great as Mozart, and use that to come up with one of the best national anthems in the world. The song became very popular in French-speaking Canada, but for some reason apparently was not heard in English-speaking Canada until 1901 when it was sung by a French schoolchildren's chorus for visiting British royalty. That set some people scurrying to try and find an English language version of it. At first, people either continued to sing it in French or came up with translations of the French into the English, but managed to get the King and England into the translations. And then a Ontario lawyer who became a lawyer and then a judge in Montreal named Robert Stanley Weir came up with his own version in 1908, which he revised in 1913. And that is what has more or less stuck. Let me put the 1913 version up for you. O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all thy sons command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north strong and free. And stand on guard, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Glorious and free, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Now, a lot of people love our national anthem, so I'm going to be gentle here and just merely comment that the English words stink. I mean, the song is so powerful that you don't really realize how silly the words are till you look at them in isolation. And in order to analyze it, I think you have to start with what's not there. God is not there. He's not mentioned in the 1913 version. I think they gave him a cameo role later, God Keep Our Land, Glorious and Free. It talks about patriotism, but what the hell does the true north mean? And how many times can you repeat, we stand on guard, we stand on guard, we stand on guard? And of course it's referred to as our home and native land, not as a nation or a republic. Bear in mind that in 1913, the British Empire was beginning to prepare for World War I. They'd known about it, I think, quite a bit before. And in that war, if I'm not mistaken, Canada didn't even declare war. Britain was at war and Canada was automatically at war. You can't celebrate a sovereign republic in the song. How about a dominion? Or maybe you could start it out, oh, British North America. Anyhow, I first began to see a problem back in the 1980s when I was in the United States talking to an American friend, and he said, oh yes, I know O Canada, and he began to sing it in French. And I was incensed, not at him, but I was incensed about the fact that I grew up in Canada and I never knew that it was written in French. I never even knew there was a French version of it. I always assumed that it was some kind of British rule Britannia type thing. Now, a national anthem should be rousing, but it doesn't have to be ridiculous like the thing that I opened up with. So, a few years back, I composed my own version of O Canada, a more slow and tender version that I thought was more in accord with both Mozart and the French words. So I'm going to play it for you against the first verse of Routier's poem. He did write 4 verses for it, and I haven't really even looked at them yet. And I hope that we can carry forth the Republican legacy of these men today.